With all apologies to the Heinz Company, you've probably heard of Heinz 57 varieties, and did you really think that there were 57 varieties? Well, that's what we call misinformation. There aren't 57 varieties, and according to this little book that I have in my hand, there really never were. The man who knows all about that is the man who wrote the Dictionary of Misinformation and a subsequent volume entitled More Misinformation. And he's with us tonight to tell us what is misinformation and where it originates and why. My guest is Tom Burnam. Well, Tom, tell me about the Heinz 57 varieties. Do you remember that particular anecdote?
I can't recall a thing about that. The
can't?
fact is that that was a number apparently just picked out of the air. I don't recall now how many varieties there were, although I remember writing the item.
Let me read this to you. I think it's kind of interesting, and it's fairly brief. It says, although the Heinz Company advertises 57 varieties, this is hardly an accurate figure. In fact, there were more than 60 varieties in 1892. There's a prevailing notion that the number was simply picked out of the air by the original Mr. Heinz. This is not true either. So you see, apparently you're suffering from misinformation right now.
Isn't that terrible?
Mr. Heinz was a good copywriter with an eye for a slogan. While riding the elevated trains in New York one day, he noticed an advertisement that featured 21 styles of shoes. It occurred to him that an adaptation of this would serve his own line, and that's how the expression 57 varieties was born.
In other words, he picked it out of the air, didn't he?
Well, I guess so.
More or less, yeah.
Your book is full of that kind of misinformation. Yeah. Where do you come up with that kind of information, for instance, on the Heinz thing? Do you even remember where you got that information?
Yes, I do happen to remember that. That was actually an item suggested by Robert Crowell, who is really the guiding spirit behind the dictionary in a sense. He had seen a small piece of mine in Saturday Review and suggested that this might make a good project for him and for me, and I guess it did. Mm-hmm. And that was one of the ones that he proposed and that I researched or helped to research and wrote. There are, maybe 10-15% of those were Bob Crowell's own ideas, and the rest come from everywhere.
This book has thousands of similar kinds of facts in it. How long did it take you to put it together?
Well, about 4 years, actually, on each one, as a matter of fact. A little longer on this one. If you count the time I first got his letter until the time of publication, it'd be a little more than 4 years, about 5 or 6. But 3 or 4 years, I'd say, of good, hard work went into it, yes. Mm-hmm. A lot of time in the library, a lot of time writing to people, a great deal of time researching every item that I could, hoping to produce an error-free book, which of course I didn't, but then.
What were the errors? I'm sure they've come to light in the few years since then.
Yes, they continue to come to light. Every time somebody buys a copy, I get a letter that says, "Dear Professor Burnam, I thought your book was fascinating." I just threw that. But on page, they're usually very nice about it. There was one embarrassing one. I had the Willamette running all the way to the Pacific, as I recall, an inadvertent bit of phrasing, to say the least.
Especially for someone who lives in Portland.
Yes. A local TV person caught that one, and I'm afraid exposed me on the air, so I changed it, however, in the paperback. That was true only in the hardback. So I was able to restore the river to its proper course. Yeah.
What do you use as a means of determining what is misinformation? How do you decide, when something really qualifies for that?
Well, of course, it may be something that you simply win a bar bet on, some minor item like, statistics and what 300 really means in baseball and that sort of thing, or more importantly, I suppose, something that has social or racial or religious implications, dangerous ones, in which case I gleefully demolish the myth. But as far as that, I suppose, if it's wrong and people believe it, that's enough to, I suppose, to qualify it as an item, yes.
Is there a lot of misinformation?
Oh my, a lot of it. And it seems indestructible. I think in the introduction to the second book I make that comment. I was thinking recently, all this stuff about D.B. Cooper, and there never was a D.B. Cooper. 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I pointed that out. Mm-hmm. UPI knows it. But
now, you mean that wasn't his real name?
No, the name that he always used, and it was properly reported at first, was Dan Cooper. That's the name they're looking for him under, the FBI still.
Where did DB come from?
Well, there was, in this case, an actual a specious reason for it. There really was a D.B. Cooper that they checked out, but he was in jail when the hijacking took place. That's about as good an alibi as you can have.
Yeah, that's pretty ironclad.
Speaking of which, in the strict sense of the meaning of that word, I think I have that in the book, too. Alibi is from the Latin in effect meaning in another place, and it's the kind of excuse that involves your presence somewhere else when the crime occurred. But so D.B. Cooper had a perfect alibi. He was in jail.
Why do people, do you suppose that people like misinformation? I mean, they must, or they try to get rid of it.
No, there
Wouldn't
does seem to be a perverse impulse in people that just, well, I won't say wallows in it because I have more faith than that in human nature. But it does seem to be, to some of it, of course, seems logical. We want to believe it. We'd like to think that Marie Antoinette did say, "Let him eat cake." She didn't, but it's characteristic of her personality insofar as we can discover what it was. She was a rather silly, vain person, although she, as Shakespeare says in another connection, she made a good death.
Did anybody say during the French Revolution, say, "Let them eat cake"?
Not during the French Revolution. It was said by, well, it was quoted as having been said, some 15 years before Marie ever saw Paris, by a princess of Tuscany, as I recall. I think it's Rousseau who quotes this otherwise unidentified princess as having made that remark.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a perfect remark for a rather vain and silly queen to have made, and so it's just been attached to her ever since.
Mm-hmm. What do you think the maybe the most significant piece of misinformation is? Is there some piece of misinformation that is so blatant that it stands out as the one that's the granddaddy of them all?
Oh, I suppose, particularly given the political climate now, it must be the protocols of the elders of Zion, which was a fraud and a deceit when it started, has remained so all these years, and is still firmly believed by millions of people, and was in fact encouraged by Henry Ford himself during the 20s when he ran a nasty little sheet called the Dearborn Independent, for which at one time as a kid, by the way, I tried to solicit subscriptions. I won a pair of stilts, as I recall.
Well, you're talking about a piece of misinformation that I'm not familiar with. Describe it for me.
Yes, it is the one that purports to represent a meeting of world Jews who are plotting to take over the world, as a matter of fact, and turn it all into one, in effect, one vast Jewish colony. It's usually just referred to as the Protocols of Zion, as a matter of fact.
This is something that falls into the category you mentioned earlier, about
yes,
something very dangerous or vicious.
Oh, yes. It apparently was originated, oddly enough, well, I don't know that it's so odd, by the Tsarist secret police. It was based on a pamphlet by a Frenchman, Joly, who wrote a mildly satiric thing involving a dialogue in hell between, I've forgotten now, two French persons that he was interested in making, neither one of them Jews. It had nothing to do with Jews or Jewishness or Zion or anything. It was a kind of Don Juan in hell type of satire. Mm-hmm. The Tsarist police altered it cleverly to make it appear that it was an actual meeting, that it actually involved a plot for world domination. They peddled this successfully through much of Europe. It was widely believed, and unfortunately it still is, and it's been demolished regularly about every 5 years.
So all misinformation is not funny, by any means?
Oh, by no means, no. That's a good instance of misinformation that is not a bit funny, no. Mm-hmm. There are others that are mildly annoying. It always annoys me a little bit that Leo Roston continues to claim credit for having originated the remark about W.C. Fields. That's one within one, of course. Mm-hmm. W.C. Fields is supposed to have said any man who hates dogs and babies can't be all bad. Well, the counter story to that is that it was said about W.C. Fields at a banquet in the late 30s by Leo Roston, the author of, and a wonderful writer, by the way. I don't mean this to denigrate any of his other works, the Hyman Kaplan stories and so on. He said it while introducing Fields at a banquet while he was still a young Hollywood unknown, and it made him almost famous overnight. Well, I published that, taking it as the truth. That part of it is the truth. He did say it. And then I got a letter from a man who said a buddy of mine on the New York Times wrote that remark in a Harper's article 2 years before Roston made it. Well, that was easy to check. So I went to the library, and sure enough, there it was. Not about Fields, as a matter of fact.
Well, this sounds like a real instance of misinformation on top of misinformation.
Yes, it was. And I might have been a little hard on Roston because I think we've all had the experience of having read something and forgotten that we've read it and inadvertently copying it. I wrote to point out to him, I wrote to Roston, we corresponded for a while about it, and he said that he had no recollection of ever having read it. But then I noticed the same story was repeated later by him, as a matter of fact. So I don't know that it's the most serious thing in the world. It was certainly a remark aptly applied to fields, but it was not originated by Leo Roston, no.
Your book, if I can change the subject, came out a few years back. How many years ago, the first one?
Well, the first one came just about the end of 1975, as a matter
So
of
it's
fact.
about 6 years ago.
Yeah.
You were maybe right at the forefront of the trivia fascination.
Oh, God. Well, it might have been that I started to say, oh, gosh, there have been lots of others like this. But yes, I think to some degree I may have inspired or re-inspired a flood of books about trivia. Of course, I always deny that mine's about trivia, though a lot of it, of course, is not very important, admittedly. But yes, I might have had a little to do with it.
Why do you think people are fascinated in trivia?
I don't know. I should think that almost anything is better than the news, and maybe that's why people like trivia, I guess.
You think it's a kind of an escape for them?
Oh, yes. And it's a little bit of the childish in all of us. You know, kids love to catch you up in something, you know. They're very literal-minded. And I think maybe there's something of that in all of us, so that when someone misquotes or misstates, a little gleeful malice, not always harmful, springs up in us, you know, and we say, no, that's not right. And by the way, I should have said earlier that I by no means originated the idea of debunking popular myth. Many others, Ashley Montague and Ed Darling, wrote a marvelous pair of books. The Prevalence of Nonsense was one of them, and The Ignorance of Certainty was the other. Bergen Evans wrote a nice one. There have been lots of others who've done it. People have pointed out Thomas Brown in the 16th century, 17th century, others. So it's an old tradition. But I think I may have revived it at maybe a lucky time. I don't know.
Are you still keeping track of trivia today?
I am, yes. I find it a kind of compulsion. I guess I got in the habit over a good many years of doing so. And both trivia and misinformation, if I can make that distinction again. People write me things, people who have read one or the other of the books. I run across something in the newspaper that I recognize as false or that makes me suspicious. You get after a while a kind of instinct for the things. Self-evident truths are so often anything but that, for example. Beautiful stories with a perfect point you're immediately suspicious of. It's rather too bad, you know. It's like being suspicious of women that are too beautiful or men that are too handsome. They think they can't be all that good, you know. There must be something wrong there. That's terrible, I admit, but that's true of information also.
Do you keep notes?
Oh, yes. When I was working on the first book particularly, I got one of these lovely little micro cassette recorders and carried that with me, and that was very helpful. I don't know what other people around me thought when they saw me talking into this little thing, but and then I have notepads in every room in the house, and I mean that literally. I always have had, as a matter of fact, for ideas that strike in the night, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. What do you think has generated your interest in misinformation?
Any letter from a publisher that says, we are thinking of doing this, would you like to write the book, generates my interest.
You became interested very quickly.
Yes, I became interested very quickly.
I see. Well,
They must
have had some idea that you were involved in that sort of thing prior to that.
Yes, I did write a short piece for used to be the Phoenix Nest Department of Saturday Review, and the title was longer than the piece. It was called Absolutely Certified 100% True Information I Am Tired of Carrying Around Because Nobody Believes It Anyway. Then there were a few items, such as the fact that Cleopatra was not Egyptian and so on. And this is what Crowell had seen and what had inspired his interest. I think he had in mind a rather serious work at first. Crowell is famous. I'm sorry to say, no longer exists. It was first absorbed into Lippincott, and then both were swallowed up by Harper's, which is better than being swallowed up by IT&T or General Motors if you're a publishing firm, admittedly.
All right.
But at that time it was Thomas Y. Crowell, and their books are still much in print, their famous series of handbooks. But as it developed, we thought it would be better to develop a less serious one, perhaps.
I assume that the fact that you have published 2 books on misinformation has not stopped you from continually gathering that sort of thing. Do you expect to, over the course of time, have enough information or misinformation together to publish another book?
Oh, I suppose, but I have the feeling maybe we've sort of run the string out. There's been some little talk of it, both on the my present publisher is Harper's, as I said, I guess. But I don't know whether there's enough interest in it. I think there's enough misinformation. So at the moment, I'm working on other kinds of projects. Just
You don't feel that you're short of misinformation, though? There's an abundance of that in the world.
Oh, yes. There's a limitless supply.
Give me an instance of something right off the top of your head of some kind of, say, humorous piece of misinformation.
Well, you know, the new book has the one called More Misinformation. I really ought to plug my own title, shouldn't I?
Sure.
Has a long section, a fairly long one, called Folk Myths and Fantasies. And I think those are the ones that I think are the funniest in many respects. The one that comes to mind is the $75 Porsche. I don't know if that started in Portland or not. It's where I first encountered it. And it soon swept the country. And briefly, it's about a man who sees an advertisement for a late model Porsche automobile, $75. He thinks it's got to be a misprint. He calls. A woman answers, no. She describes the car. He says, hold everything, I'll be right over. So he rushes over, and sure enough, it's a $30,000 car, and she's willing to sell it for $75,000. And he writes out a check, and he says, forgive me, but why are you doing this? She said, well, my husband called last night from San Francisco. It appears that he ran away with his secretary. He wanted me to sell his car and send him the money. Of course, it's a lovely story.
I've heard that story.
Yes.
You're not going to tell me that's not true.
Oh, no, not a word of truth in it.
Oh,
I'm
no.
afraid.
Well,
At
now
least insofar as I could check it out. Sometimes you can't check these out. It's too good to be true almost. You want it to be. When I started chasing down sources, because it was a local story, and I discovered that, well, no, they hadn't really heard from the man himself. It had been someone who had been told the story, and that someone said, well, no, and so on. That's what you usually end up with.
I think I would rather that you had not told me that.
I know. I felt sorry that I know. It appeared, let's see, I discovered later it had been current later in New York. Portland may have the honor of having originated that story.
Well,
it became $175 there, New York prices
I
being.
think regardless of what you say, that I'm going to continue to believe that story.
One should believe in it. It's, the reason I don't get into religion is that there are matters of belief that are not rational, but one should believe with one's heart, if not with one's mind, and I think that's the kind of story one should believe even if it isn't so, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Tom, this has been very, and if I can use the word, informative.
Thank you. Not misinformative?
Not misinformative. We've been talking with Tom Burnam, who's the author of both the Dictionary of Misinformation and another book entitled More Misinformation. Thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you very much.